So welcome to the MFIPPA Access and Correction Statistics webinar. Thank you for registering and joining us today. There's been a great response and interest in our series of statistics-related informational webinars, so thank you everyone for your engagement. I hope you are all well and staying safe. My name is Victoria Sclatos. I'm an information officer at the IPC. I may have communicated with some or many of you over the years because some of the names who've RSVP'd look very familiar to me. So I'm very pleased to be with you today. We're also very pleased to hold this webinar. It's our third in our series of statistics-related informational webinars we're hosting over a 4-week period. Some of you may have also attended our first 2 webinars, starting with the PHIPPA Breach Statistics webinar a few weeks ago and the PHIPPA Access and Correction Statistics webinar just last week. So if that's you, welcome back. A few housekeeping matters before we begin. This webinar will be recorded. Please be assured that we will notify everyone of when the recordings are available. You're also welcome to send us questions using the chat function. Note that everyone can see the questions that are being asked and by whom, and we will try to answer as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. Also note that I will be using the terms MFIPPA, FIPPA, and the Acts interchangeably throughout this presentation. Okay? And with that, let's begin. These are the areas that we'll be covering today. We'll begin by looking at MFIPPA and FIPPA statistics requirements, then briefly look at some administrative aspects of the report, such as login information and setting up a new account. After that, we will delve into the actual statistics questionnaire with a selected overview of the stats survey, focusing on the sections about which we get the most questions. We will then finish with some helpful tips and takeaways, share a few IPC statistics resources with you, as well as how you can contact us if you ever have questions about your statistical report. I wanted to begin, though, with this quote from Commissioner Cosine, taken from last year's annual report. With the ongoing pandemic and the challenges it's created for everyone, we just want to thank you for continuing to champion access and privacy rights in times of uncertainty. We're committed to working with you, our stakeholders, in upholding these rights during these very challenging and difficult times, now and in the future, and in whatever that new normal is. So thank you again. On that note, let's turn to MFIPPA, FIPPA statistics requirements. All FIPPA and MFIPPA institutions are required to submit their access, correction, and other statistics, even if they received no requests during the reporting year. So institutions must submit a report, like I said, even if you had 0 FOI or correction requests, in which case it takes literally seconds to submit your report. Moving on. If you've ever wondered why this report is required, it's set by Ontario's public access and privacy laws. Specifically, the requirements for statistical reporting with respect to FIPPA and MFIPPA are set out under Section 34 of FIPPA and Section 26 of MFIPPA, respectively. As you know, there are 2 types of FOI requests captured by the statistical report, and these need to be entered separately. We often get questions about this, so it's an important issue here. The first type of FOI requests are personal information requests, where the requester or their authorized representative, this could be a substitute decision maker like a power of attorney, for example, if they're acting on behalf of the individual. And so if they're asking for information about themselves, treat this as a personal information request. The second type of general request are general records requests, where the requester is either asking for general information or information that includes personal information about someone else. So in those circumstances, please treat those types of records as a general record request. Here's another statistical requirement. All written requests under Section 17, 36(2)A, and 37 of MFIPPA, and Sections 24, 47(2)A, and 48 of FIPPA must be reported to the IPC, including those that have been abandoned or withdrawn. Now, these sections that I just highlighted here represent the right of access and correction provisions under both acts. It's important to note at this juncture that for statistical reporting purposes, we're interested in the number of written FOI requests accompanied by a $5 application fee that you received and completed. Please do not include requests that were not in writing or without the application fee. Similarly, only include written correction requests you received and completed in your report. So the summary of this is that no informal request should be included in the report, just formal written requests. Moving on. For statistical reporting purposes, a request is considered to be a new request when it has been received directly by your institution from the requester during the reporting year. And again, reporting year for statistical reporting purposes is January 1st through December 31st. New requests are also those which have been transferred from other institutions for completion by your institution. So any requests that are transferred in from other institutions to your institutions, treat that as a new request as well. Now let's briefly look at a few administrative aspects of the statistical report, namely login information and how to set up a new account. This is the statistics homepage, what we see here. It's statistics.ipc.on.ca. If you have your login ID and password, you're set to go. You're set to log on and complete your report. If, however, you've forgotten your password, I just want to draw your attention to the bottom left-hand corner of this landing page. You can click on Forgot Password, and this will take you here, to this page here, the Login ID and Password Recovery. Remember that your login ID is always your institution number. That's very important. So if you're ever wondering what your login ID is, it's always equivalent to your institution number. With respect to the password, as long as the system has the correct primary email address for your institution, then you can input this and click on Recovery. And so what will happen is that an automatic email will then be sent to the primary email address with instructions on how to reset the password. Moving on to setting up a new account. If you need to set up a new account, click on the Please Register Here link, again at the bottom left-hand corner of the landing page. This will take you to a page where it's asking you for this information here. So if you're ever a first-time user or first-time submitting a statistical report, or there's a new institution that you need to create a profile for, you'll need to set up a new account by including the information that you see here, the name of your organization, the name and email address of the head of the organization, the name, mailing address, email address, and telephone number of the person responsible for completing the report, in other words, the primary contact, and your language preference, English or French. Now, before we move to the statistical questionnaire, I also wanted to include, talk to you about a scenario that comes up often during the statistical reporting season. So back to the login. So let's say your institution is also a health information custodian under the health privacy law. So some public institutions, whether you're MFIPPA or FIPPA, you may also be a health information custodian under PHIPPA. For example, a hospital. A hospital is a good example. You must submit one annual statistical report under FIPPA and the applicable reports under PHIPPA. As such, you have the option of a single login ID and a password to submit all reports, which is convenient if the same person will be submitting both reports. Another option is you may wish to have one login ID and password for FIPPA and another for PHIPPA, which makes it easier if two different people will be submitting the reports on behalf of your organization. Now, that all depends on your organizational structure. I bring this up because it is a common question that we're getting in recent weeks and in previous years as well. So please keep this in mind, and if you have any questions about that, don't hesitate to give us a call and ask to speak with an information officer about that, okay? So now we'll move on to the actual statistics questionnaire. Note that MFIPPA, FIPPA reports mirror each other. The sections of the survey under both acts are in very large part the same. So we're going to embark on a selected overview of the questionnaire, specifically focusing on the sections about which we get most questions. So first off, let's look at Section 2.1, Inconsistent Use. So what is an inconsistent use? An inconsistent use occurs when personal information from a personal information bank is used or disclosed differently from the way it is used on a regular basis. So every institution should have a personal information bank. So this section asks the number of times your institution made an inconsistent use of personal information contained in its personal information bank. Just to share an observation with you, this section is usually 0 for the majority of submissions. What I recommend that you do is take a look at Section 35 of MFIPPA and Section 46 of FIPPA for information about inconsistent use in the context of your personal information banks. Okay? Now, please note the boxes below. I also want to draw your attention to the text box in red. I like to think of these boxes as a fork in the road, if you will, in terms of how the rest of your report will unfold. It's very important that you check off the right box at the outset of your submission. Otherwise, you will encounter error messages later on in the report. So to avoid that, please ensure you're checking off the applicable box. For the purposes of this presentation, I've checked off the middle box where the institution has received or completed formal written access request. Now, if you received 0, however, then you're going to click off the first box, and this will take you to the end of the report where you can click and submit and finish. Like I said earlier, it's going to take you seconds to submit. If you received only a correction request, please check off the third box, and this will take you to Section 11 where you can input your correction stats. Okay? Now let's look at Section 3, the number of requests received and completed. This is another section we often get questions about. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, and it bears repeating, there are 2 types of information requests, and these need to be entered separately. In fact, you will see that throughout most of the survey, statistics are reported under these 2 main categories. The first is personal information request, the first column, where the requester or their authorized representative is asking for information about themselves. And the second being general records request, where the requester is asking for general information or information that includes personal information about someone else. So in this case, you would treat this as a general record. And as you can see what I've highlighted here, because in the previous slide I checked off the box where I've received 1 or more access requests, this section here, the number of requests must be greater than 0 because you've already said that you have 1 or more, and so it has to be in line with the formulas here. Okay? So Section 3.1 captures the number of requests received during the reporting year under each type of request, personal information and general records, whereas Section 3.2 captures the number of requests you completed under each type of request during the reporting year. And again, reporting year is January 1st through December 31st. In upcoming sections, all points lead to 3.2, so that's something that I really want to underscore here. As we will see, the various breakdowns in subsequent sections must tie back to the total number of completed requests under Section 3.2. So please bear that in mind. Now let's look at how to calculate the total number of requests received and completed. It's something else that we often get questions about. So I put together this table to calculate the total number of requests received. So this is 3.1, okay? Start with the number of new requests your institution directly received during the reporting year. Add to this the number of requests that were transferred in from other institutions to your institution to complete, if any. Now, this will give you the total number of requests received, in other words, equal to 3.1. Now, a side note, if another institution transfers a request to your institution to process and complete, I beg your pardon, this most likely is because you have a greater interest in the records requested. This may mean that you have custody or control of the records so as to make a decision on access, okay? So when that happens, it's because your institution has a greater interest in the records at issue. Now let's look at how to calculate the total number of requests completed. Take the total number of new requests received equal to 3.1s. This is your starting point, okay? Add to this the number of requests carried forward from the previous year, if any. So sometimes you'll receive a request, let's say, in late December or sometime in December, and you have not completed the request. You're going to carry it forward to the next calendar year. So you're going to add this to this particular calculation. This will give you a subtotal from which you subtract the total number of requests transferred out to another institution to complete, and the total number of requests carried over to the next year to complete, if any. Okay? So this will give you the total number of completed requests. So basically, you start off with the requests received, add any requests carried forward from the previous year. From that subtotal, subtract requests transferred out to other institutions, and subtract any requests carried over to the next year. And this will give you 3.2, number of requests completed. Section 4 of the questionnaire. Here we're looking for a breakdown of the total number of requests completed for each category of sources per request. So enter the number of personal information and general records requests you were completed from the sources listed here. Make sure that the totals in this section tie back to the total number of completed requests under section 3.2. So again, that's why I've highlighted it here. In most sections, everything has to tie back to 3.2. So ensure that as you move along in the statistical report, everything is in line and ties back to 3.2 where needed. Now here's a tip for this section. Under the individual public category, use that category to capture requests made by individuals themselves, and use the individual by agent category to capture requests made on behalf of the individuals by a third party, such as a substitute decision maker, a lawyer, some authorized representative who's acting on behalf of the requester. So we often get questions about that as well in terms of when to use individual by agent. Moving on to section 5, let's look at this section of the report, time to completion. This is where we begin to look at compliance rates. Okay? In this section, you're asked to enter the number of completed personal information and general records requests in the appropriate categories, 30 days or less, 31 to 60 days, etc. And as you can see, it's per personal information requests on the one hand and general records on the other. Okay? Now, a few tips for time to completion I think that are worthwhile making note of. If your institution received a transferred request from another institution, the time to completion starts when the first institution received the request. Okay, that's very important. We often get questions about, I just got a request transferred into my institution. We have a greater interest and we have to make a decision on access. What is the time to completion? Well, in that case, the time to completion starts when the first institution received the request. Another tip, the time from when a fee estimate or interim decision letter has been issued up to the time the deposit has been paid is not included when calculating the number of days to complete a request. So sometimes you have to issue an interim decision or a fee estimate because the fee is more than $100 and you need a 50% deposit before you proceed. You need the green light from the requester. So until you get the green light and the deposit, that time lapsed should not be included within the time to completion calculation. And finally, this is an important tip as well. It's a common question we get. The time a request is in the appeal process is also excluded when calculating how long it took to complete the request. So for all intents and purposes, when you have issued your decision, you've completed it from your end. What happens thereafter, whether or not it escalates to an appeal, you don't have a crystal ball, so you don't know if that's going to happen. So for statistical reporting purposes, do not include the time the request was in the appeal process. Okay? So moving forward, as you know, the Acts state that requests for access to information should be completed within 30 days. In cases where there is a need to search numerous records or to make consultations with persons outside of the institution can extend the 30-day limit and still be in compliance with the Acts. Now, this is otherwise known as extended compliance and can be achieved by issuing a notice of extension to the requester and or a notice to the affected person or an affected party to the request. Okay? Now, Section 6, what we're seeing here, delves further into compliance rates. It's broken down into 4 different situations that are mutually exclusive and are used to determine the number of requests that are in compliance or not in compliance with the statutory timelines under the Acts. Now, the 4 situations, we see them here, apply to both types of requests, personal information and general records, and they include: the first situation is no notices issued. Here we're looking for a breakdown of the number of requests completed where no notice was issued within the 30-day statutory time limit, as well as the number of requests completed in excess of 30 days where no notices were issued. So note that each situation has a similar breakdown along these lines, as we'll see in the next slide. In this situation, what we're dealing with here is the situation is where both a notice of extension and a notice to affected person was issued. Once again, we see a similar breakdown here, right? How many did you complete within 30 days? How many were completed in excess of 30 days? Part C, the third situation here, is only a notice of extension was issued. Same breakdown. Part D, and finally Part D, only a notice to affected person issued. Now, an affected person is someone who did not make the request themselves, but during the course of processing your request, you've realized that there's a third party that's affected by this FOI request, and the law requires you to notify them of that, and notify them by way of a notice letter or a notice to the affected person. Okay? Added together, A through D, the total of all situations should tie back, again, to 3.2, the total number of completed requests. So staying on this particular slide, please note that Section 6A, just below that, of the questionnaire, it gives institutions an opportunity to write any reasons that made it difficult for them to meet the 30-day timeline, the time to completion limit. You can also include circumstances you believe will improve your ability to be in compliance with the Acts. We understand during the pandemic that may very well be a contributing factor. It certainly was last year, so we do anticipate that being the case this year to some extent. Moving along to Section 7. Section 7 of the statistical questionnaire asks you to indicate how your institution dealt with each of the requests for access to information. Okay? So, as you can see, there are various outcomes from the full disclosure to requests withdrawn, abandoned, or non-jurisdictional. So, again, what course of action was taken with each of the completed requests? And in most cases, now, if I draw your attention to the red text box there, in most cases, the sum of all entries under personal information and general records should be equal to or greater than the amounts in 3.2, the total number of requests completed. So in most cases, this sum is equal to 3.2, except for in cases where there are multiple outcomes of a request, and that sometimes happens. In this case, there isn't, but sometimes I'll give you an example. Let's say you complete a request in which you decide to disclose all your information, only to discover that the request is ultimately abandoned by the requester. Okay? In such cases, mark each applicable outcome of a request from the options listed. So it does happen where there are multiple outcomes. If there are, it's fine, as long as it's equal to or greater than 3.2. At minimum, it should be equal to the total number of requests. Now, before we look at Section 8, let's look at this slide. As you know, MFIPPA and FIPPA exemptions and exclusions live within the law, right? So MFIPPA exemptions specifically fall within Sections 6 through 16 and 38, while the main exclusion clauses fall under Section 52. FIPPA exemptions fall within Sections 12 through 23 and Section 49, while the main exclusion clause falls under Section 65. So keep this in mind, especially as we move to Section 8 of the report, Exemptions and Exclusions Applied. So a few things to note in this section. Every request that was exempted in part or in full must have at least one exemption listed, but may have more than one. So therefore, unlike previous sections, there is no correlation between the total sum of Section 8 and the total number of requests completed as entered in box 3.2. And the reason being is because more than one exemption and or exclusion may be applied to a given request. Okay? So for example, I'll give you an example. A request may be denied and information withheld due to a combination of the solicitor-client privilege exemption and the labor relations exclusion. So you're using two options here. One is an exemption, the other one's an exclusion, so it's more than one. And so basically what this section is asking you to do is indicate which exemptions and or exclusions were applied to those requests where your institution withheld some or all of the requested information. Now, one final note, as you can see, I'd like to draw your attention to the red circles on the table here. Now, the MFIPPA exemption under Section 14 applies to personal privacy. Now, this is the personal privacy of a third party, and by extension, only applies to general records requests. The corresponding section for FIPPA is Section 21. So remember, when a requester is asking for information that includes personal information about someone else, treat this as a general record. This is why we see a non-applicable note under the personal information column, because Section 14 or Section 21 under MFIPPA and FIPPA respectively does not apply to personal information. The second circle here under general records, where my cursor is here, the MFIPPA exemption under Section 38 applies to the personal information of the requester, and by extension, only to personal information requests. So this is why we see a non-applicable note under the general records column, because it simply doesn't apply to general records. It's personal to the individual who's making the request. Okay? So at the end of the questionnaire, once you've filled out all the sections, it's going to take you here where you can submit questionnaire. If you click this button here where my cursor is, you have to submit this questionnaire in order to finalize and confirm that you've actually submitted your report. Now keep in mind, you don't have to complete your report in one sitting. You can complete and save, and when you log on again at a later time or date, then the system will take you to the section that you left off at, as long as you do this before the deadline, right? Now, if ever you need a copy for your own records, then this is the key or the button to press, view a printer-friendly version. By doing so, you will be able to save it as a PDF document for your own records or even print it out as well, okay? When you submit your questionnaire, my suggestion is also to log off and exit your browser. I've noticed that some observations from institutions, they've told me that when they do that, they don't get any error messages, or it assures that your report has been completed. So it's a good practice to do, just in case. The other thing that I also wanted to mention is that once you submit your questionnaire, an automatic email should be sent to the primary contact on file, whoever was the primary contact who completed the report, indicating and just confirming that you've submitted your report, it's confirmed, right? But at any given time between submitting your report and the deadline, if you notice that there's an error, you need to amend or edit the report, you can do so, even after you've submitted it. So the system will allow you to go in, correct it, but then you have to submit questionnaire again in order for the changes to take effect. Okay, so please keep that in mind as well. And again, then you'll receive this prompt here about the deadline. Again, it's March 31st. Moving on, some tips and takeaways. Now, there's a number of tips that we've shared with you during this presentation, but these are tips that are really the source of a lot of questions that we get. So I wanted to focus on those. New requests, again, they include those that have been received directly by your institution and those that have been transferred in from other institutions to your institution to complete. Remember, for statistical reporting purposes, we're focused on written FOI requests accompanied by a $5 application fee. This must be reported, including those that were abandoned or withdrawn. Okay? So please don't focus on informal requests. Even though people have, the public, everyone has the right to make an informal request, and those are just as important. But for statistical reporting purposes, we're looking for formal written FOI requests accompanied by a $5 application fee. Now, the time a request is in the appeal process is excluded when calculating how long it took to complete the request. So this is another common question we get. Should we include the time it was in the appeal? And the answer is no. Remember, time to completion is the time it took for you to issue a decision letter. Keep track of statistics over the course of the calendar year. And again, I may be preaching to the choir, if you will. I know that many of you do this, but it is worth repeating because it really will help you this time of year. If you've tracked it over the course of the calendar year, it's going to really help you submit your statistics this time. A few administrative tips here. Remember, your login ID is always your institution number, and the primary email address will receive an automatic email when resetting the password. It's only the primary email address. So it's very important that everything is in sync. If there's been a change in personnel or a successor and we are not informed of that, then there may be an issue there. So primary email addresses will receive an automatic email there, okay, about the resetting the password. Moving on, what I wanted to do was to share a few statistics resources with you that may help you with your submission here. First is the FAQ. It's the frequently asked questions on the statistical report, both for MFIPPA and FIPPA. Many of the questions we've answered during this presentation, by the way. I will share it with everyone when the webinar becomes available on our YouTube channel. I will follow up and share links to these resources. They're all available on our website, by the way, under the guidance for organizations. You simply click on the statistics side, and it will get you to these, at least this particular one, the FAQ. And this one here. The second one is the year-end, the MFIPPA, FIPPA workbooks and completion guides. There's one for FIPPA and another one for FIPPA, MFIPPA and FIPPA. They more or less mirror each other. The third one that I really wanted to draw your attention to is a webinar that we held a few years ago. And it's, if you really want to understand exemptions and exclusions a little bit further, this is an excellent webinar. It's available on our YouTube channel, and again, I'll share it with everyone. And it really gives practical examples that we often receive questions about, right? So this is an excellent webinar, and I think that it will help you not only with your statistical report, but it will help you going into the future, right, when you're looking at how to process requests and whether or not to apply any exemptions, discretionary or mandatory as they may be. So if you ever have questions or concerns about your statistical report, please don't hesitate to call us or email us. If you call us, just simply ask to speak with an information officer. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day. Take care. Bye-bye.